everything that Galia said, I think, is really true, that I have self-consciously been collaborative as an academic with the idea that 1 + 1 = 3. That if you collaborate, I've had the wonderful experience of having good teachers, but also having good teachers who are my collaborators. We collaborate not with people wonderful story about Mr. Pickwick goes north to Scotland, and he visits with Mr. Potts, who's the editor of the Eatanswill Gazette. And they're sitting down after dinner having a glass of port, and Mr. Potts says to Mr. Pickwick, "I expect that you've been reading my recent series of articles." And Mr. Pickwick says, "I'm embarrassed. I've been out of town. I haven't received the Gazette. What have you been writing on?" And so Mr. Potts says, "Well, I've written a series of articles on Chinese metaphysics." And so Mr. Pickwick says, "My goodness," he says, "that's an abstruse subject. Where would you get your information?" He said, "Well, I use the Encyclopedia Britannica." And Mr. Pickwick says, "I have enormous respect for the Encyclopedia Britannica, but I wasn't aware that it had an entry on Chinese metaphysics." And so Mr. Potts leans over and he grabs Mr. Pickwick's knee and squeezes it. And he said, "What I did was I looked up China under C and metaphysics under M, and I combined my information." And it's funny, but that's precisely the state of the art when we think about how we have come to understand the Chinese tradition. And it's because of that I wanted to write this particular book. Like Confucian role ethics is something but a vocabulary. What we do with Chinese ethics is we argue. Is it Kantian deontic ethics? Is it utilitarian, John Stuart Mill? Is it Aristotelian eretaic virtue ethics? Or is it Humean sentimentalist ethics? But the point is that it is Confucian ethics that was there 2,000 years before this encounter with Western ethical theory. And so we use our Western framework, our Western theoretical structures, conceptual structures, to understand China. And so what I wanted to do is I wanted to say, let's have a conversation, but first let's let the tradition speak for itself. Let's use its own vocabulary to say what it has to say, and then we can bring it into conversation. So that was the inspiration for this book. Now, to start with, the idea of Confucian as an example of the problem, we use this word Confucianism. Confucianism was a term invented by the second governor of Hong Kong in a book that he wrote called The Chinese. And but when we look at the character, if we speak Chinese, we don't say Confucianism, we say Ru Xue. Ru Xue. Ru is a social class. Ru, the etymology of the term suggests that it means something like gentle or mild. And so we think of a gentleman or the gentry, gentlefolk. And so Ru is a social class that exists some 80 generations, 60 generations before Confucius, and 80 generations after Confucius. If we lived within the Chinese narrative, the people in this room are Ru. We're the people who inherit the cultural tradition. We are the people who expand upon it, who bring our own thoughts to it, who use it to address the pressing issues of our time. And when our hair turns white, we pass it on to the next generation and recommend to them that they continue this process. And so it's not a potted ideology. It's not a set of fixed values. It is a narrative, a cultural narrative that has different content as the tradition changes over time. When Buddhism comes into China, Buddhism transforms Chinese philosophy. Chinese philosophy transforms Buddhism. When Western learning, the Jesuits, the Protestants come into China, Chinese philosophy is transformed, and the content of what it means to be Ru, it becomes something importantly different. And so if we look at the text itself, you want to be an exemplary Ru, not a petty Ru. It's very conservative. 修而不做. You want to inherit the tradition fully. You want to respect the ancients. You want to appreciate and to carry over the tradition into our own generation. But at the same time, it is a critical tradition. 如之何,如之何, 我应该这么做, 我应该这么做. What should I do? What should I do? And it's also progressive, a kind of emergent tradition. 温故而知新, to understand the past as a way of forging ahead and creating the new. And so this is a tradition that is self-consciously respectful of the past, but as critical and carries over and extends the past. And so when we think of a term like Dao, we translate as the way, but Dao in this tradition is Ren Neng Hong Dao. The human being broadens the way. Dao, Xingzhi Er Cheng. Dao is made in the walking. So Dao is not some kind of a way that is given to the human being from some external source. Dao is something that human beings do together. And so when we look at the way in which we have understood this tradition, we've made it into a second quality, a second stage Abrahamic tradition. We translate Tian as heaven. We translate Yi as righteousness. Righteousness is not a word that we use in English. Righteousness is a biblical term. If you go to church, you use a word like righteousness. We translate Dao as the way with a capital W. We translate Li as ritual. Your relationship with your grandmother, is that a ritual? That's what Li means. It has to do with a social grammar. It has to do with the way in which we relate to each other within the institutions of family and society, community. And so what has happened is we have made this tradition into something familiar to us, but that has very little to do with its own tradition. If we use Saussure's distinction, Saussure gives us a distinction between langue and parole. If you ask, well, how then should we translate these terms? We can do better than that. We can do better than that. But at the end of the day, a tian means tian, and yi means yi. And Wittgenstein, the limits of our language are the limits of our world. That we have to learn some of this language if we're going to understand the tradition. Tian means tian. But, according to Saussure again, parole, that our natural languages are hugely powerful. We can speak English and we can understand what Chinese mean by tian. We can speak Chinese and we can understand what Chinese mean by what Abrahamic people mean by a concept of God. We can speak Hebrew and we can understand what Chinese mean by this notion of the way, of Dao. So, and if we need proof of this, it's very simple. Go to your bookstore, the I Ching, the Zhongyong, the Tao Te Ching, the Chinese philosophical canons are not shelved in a philosophy section, they're shelved in Eastern religions. Go into your library. That Chinese philosophy is not shelved in philosophy, it's shelved in religion. And this is worrisome because philosophy is not a neutral term. As somebody who's a historian will say, I'm a historian. Somebody who's a sociologist will say, I'm a sociologist. Somebody who does philosophy is not inclined to say, I'm a philosopher. We say, I study philosophy, I teach philosophy, I do philosophy. But if you say, I'm a philosopher, then, oh, are you Kant or Aristotle? Or, it seems to be self-aggrandizing to say that you're philosophy. So the point is that philosophy is respectful, and we haven't respected this tradition in that way. So Legge, the great translator of the classics, he self-consciously uses the theological vocabulary of Joseph Butler and asks questions that human nature in Mencius is as nearly as possible identical with that of Bishop Butler. It is much to be wished that instead of the term heaven, vague and indefinite, Mencius has simply said God, So this isn't helpful in understanding the tradition. As when we take the term Tao, immediately, I am the way, the truth, and the life, a Western person understanding the tradition. But if we let the tradition speak for itself, that if we look at the Jimwen, the bronzes, the character for Tao has the human foot and the human profile as part of the character. It's not his way, it's not the way, it's our way together. If we look at the term de, where Dao de come together as virtue or virtuosity, de too has the human profile and the idea of moving straight ahead, to live an upright way, but an upright way that is inclusive of us as human beings, not something that is given to the human being from something outside. So Confucianism is the intergenerational transmission and embodiment of a compounding cultural legacy within a complex network of family lineages closely aligned with the prime moral imperatives of the tradition. The centerpiece, and this is where we can really have a conversation, but the governing metaphor of this tradition is jia, is family. Yan Fu, the great translator of Western culture, said that if you talk about the 2,000 years of Chinese imperial history, 30% emperor, 70% jiazu, shizu, 70% family lineages. That the life of the people was lived, the economic, the political, the religious life of the people was lived within family lineages. And this is the source of social and political order, not something that is coming from something above. And so the prime moral imperatives really have to do with the idea of family. In Chinese, you don't say country, you say 国家, country family. You don't say human being, you say 人家, human family. If I walk in this room and I say, speak English, everyone, everybody, please stand up. If I speak Chinese, 大家请站起来, big family, please stand up. In the classroom, 师父 or 师母. In the classroom, 学弟, 学姐, student younger brother, student older sister. That family is the governing metaphor of the tradition. And so at sort of an elite level, you have the rule, but this idea of intergenerational transmission is also the value, the governing value broadly. So if we look on the bones, on the oracle bones that date back to the Shang Dynasty, 1500 BCE, the character for old is Einstein with the hair on a cane. And so this character is then stylized, and so the modern Chinese character becomes Lao. But when we find the character for Xiao, family reverence, on the oracle bones, instead of Einstein leaning on a cane, he's leaning on the next generation. And so this intergenerational transmission is the older generation having embodied the tradition, passing it on to the younger generation, and the younger generation achieving their identity through the embodiment of what has come before. And this is not unfamiliar to us. Emerson has this wonderful image when he talks about culture and civilization. Civilization depends on morality. He has this picture of a carpenter standing on a ladder trying to address a timber, going against nature, going against gravity, going it alone, and how awkward and how inefficient doing that is. But if you put the stick on the ground and you bring the broad axe over to cut the stick, it falls apart. That gravity, the whole cosmos, the world comes behind your shoulders and enables you to split the stick. And so culture, civilization is like this. If we transmit our wisdom from generation to generation, then we become efficient as human beings. We become productive as human beings. Go it alone, and we achieve very little. And so in this effort, Gallia was saying, I have this focus field conception of person. We can spend a semester. We should read the I Ching, the Dazhuan of the I Ching, in order to understand the cosmology. We don't have time today. But we can take Chinese medicine as a practical application of the cosmology that is behind not only what we call Confucianism, but Taoism and Buddhism as well. That when the Chinese doctor listens to our body, the doctor is listening to the way in which the different organs are interacting. And if they're not obstructed, if they're not stagnant, if they're not too hot or too cold, then the body is functioning as it should. But the body doesn't finish with the epidermis. That the body, the heart-mind of the body exists within the relationships that constitute it. And in some way, this heart-mind can be used as an image of the concept of person. And so this heart-mind needs the sunshine, needs the air, needs nourishment. And so the heart-mind physiologically functions well if all of these things are coming together in their relationships and are productive. But the heart-mind is also thinking and feeling is what we do. And so we think we're very clever sinologists. We understand that Chinese don't think and feel, that Chinese think and feel in the same place. And so we translate the Xin as heart-mind. We translate it as heart-mind. And if in our thinking and feeling we're not obstructed, we're not stagnant, we're not too hot, not too cold, then the entire person is functioning well. But if you ask the question, I understand that it is relationally constituted, that all of these relationships come together to make the heart-mind, but what is the heart-mind in itself? The heart-mind in itself is an abstraction out of those relationships. The heart-mind is a focus within a field. The heart-mind is what it is by virtue of the relationships that come together to sponsor it. And so there's a holography here. It's holographic, that the heart-mind is a function of all of the different kind of relationships that come together. And so if we talk about Confucian conception of person, it's holistic. That holistic meaning that it is what it is by virtue of its relationships with everything else. It is processual. The I Ching, shang shang bu xi, shang shang bu yi, the ongoing procreativity of the cosmos. It is constituted by its relationship. And so we're talking about a doctrine of internal relations as opposed to external relations. That we are constituted by the roles and relationships that we live together. This is the Confucian conception of person. In the 1980s, there was a book where somebody, having read Aristotle, who wants us to be nouns, said, I think I am a verb. But in fact, in the Confucian tradition, we're gerunds. That if you're going to talk about person, you're personing. You're not a human being, but a human becoming. If you want to talk about Tao, It's not the way, it's way making. It's something under construction in every generation. Each generation has to step up and be a road builder for his or her time. And so the gerundive nature of the tradition is fundamental when we think about the concept of person, human becomings. That individual is not something that you start with. You start with inchoate relations. And then because you cultivate a relationship with my spouse, with my old friends, cultivate my relationship with my students, then gradually people know your name. You become distinctive. And then you become distinguished if you really work at it. And so your individuality is something that you achieve, not something that you begin with. Your individuality as a person, your uniqueness, is not exclusive of your relationships, but by virtue of the quality you've been able to achieve in your relationships. So we clever sinologists, in translating xin as heart-mind, really have to ponder the fact that there are all of these other dualisms that we have to overcome if we want to understand xin. That is xin, self or other, 两个都是, that it's both. Is it object and subject, or is it object or subject? It's both at the same time. That xin is the world and the person. Is it body and mind? It's both. Is it structure and function? 体用? It's both, and so on and so on. That all of these dualisms have to be overcome in order to give proper measure to this idea of xin, of heart, mind, of person. So if we, instead of thinking about heart, mind, we think about person, a person is a person self or other, is both together. Is a person object or subject, is both together, and so on. When we look at Mengzi, 万物皆备于我意, that the myriad things are here in me. Is there any enjoyment greater than, with the myriad happenings of the world all implicated here in me, to turn personally inward and to thus find resolution with these happenings? What he's saying is that introspection is really introspection. Intro is not going inside yourself, is sort of reversing the idea, looking for states of mind. Introspection is looking at the way in which I'm related to all of the things that constitute my world, and then taking my measure, taking my weight and measure by virtue of the quality of those relationships. Is there any way of seeking to become consummate in my person more immediate than making every effort to act empathetically by extending myself into the perspectives entertained by others? So the way that I become consummate as a human being is through deference. Is that in a relation, in this tradition, morality quite simply is growth in relationships. How should I act here? How can I put myself in somebody else's position? How can I take into account the interests of this unique person? But then when I behave here, I have to anticipate that this person is different, and so 如之何, I have to ask, what should I do? What should I do in each of these situations? That there's no catechism, there's no set of rules, that morality is hard work. You have moral artistry, you have imagination. Moral imagination is fundamental to the project of becoming morally competent as a human being. Having the imagination to understand that different people are going to entertain situations in, importantly, different ways. And again, that those who make the most of their body, heart, minding realize their nature, realize who they are, and in realizing their nature, they realize the cosmos. This idea that holography, as I cultivate myself, I cultivate the world. That personal cultivation is cosmic. The cosmos becomes different by virtue of the meaning that we're able to achieve in the relationships that constitute us, in our roles and relationships in community. And so when we look at this term, 人, that is Ren means person. But Ren as virtuosity is something that is achieved with the concept of person and the number 2. The way that you become consummate as a human being is by cultivating the relationships that locate you within family and a community. And so again, with this notion of Ren, just like the notion of Xin, these kinds of dualisms that are part of our understanding that when we begin from the concept of the discrete individual really don't have purchase. These dualisms don't work with this notion of Ren. So this idea, the idea of the doctrine of internal relations, what does that mean? Autonomous subjects and objects are finally only artifacts of abstraction. What we refer to as things, whether mountains or human beings or complex phenomena like histories, are simply the experienced results of having established relatively constant horizons of value or relevance. They are not, as our common sense insists, natural occurring realities or things. Indeed, what we take to be objects existing independently of ourselves are in actuality simply a function of habitual patterns of relationships. This amounts to an ontological gestalt shift from taking independent and dependent actors to be first-order realities and relations among them as second-order, to seeing relationality as first-order or ultimate reality and all individual actors as conventionally abstracted or derived from them. The meaning here is friendship is first, and then the people who constitute the friendship are abstractions from what is most concrete, and that is the relationality. It's a fundamentally, if we think ecologically, each element within an ecology is what it is by virtue of its relationships with the other elements that constitute the ecology. That's what they're saying there. And so the thing that you lift out of the ecology is at risk by virtue of removing it from its relationships with everything else. Now, and this is not Lao Wai, some foreigner coming along and telling the Chinese what their tradition is about. Probably the most distinguished social scientist of the 20th century in China is this man Fei Xiaotong, a sociologist. And he gives us the same kind of contrast. Fei Xiaotong does an undergraduate degree at Beida, then does his graduate work at Tsinghua, and then goes to LSE and studies with Malinowski, the founder of anthropology. And he comes back and he says, the concept of person is so different in terms of the starting point, the point of departure within the Western tradition, that I have to invent a different vocabulary in order to talk about Chinese sociology. And so he talks, this is the Western idea, 团体格局, where what you are doing is you're bundling things together under the auspices. What makes them one is the concept of God. So they are bundled together by virtue of their relationship with Godhead. And so you have a part-whole kind of a model of relationality. But when it comes to the Chinese tradition, you have this cha xiu geju. You have the differential mode of association that is composed of webs woven out of countless personal relationships. Remember Charles Taylor. He talks about human beings as webs of interlocution. Webs of interlocution. That we are who we are by virtue of discourse. That we're discursive, and that discourse takes on physical forms. It takes on, we sing together, we eat together, we talk together, we body together. That the concentric circles formed when a stone is thrown into a lake. The idea of relationships in Chinese, lun, is the same kind. The word ripple is lun. The term circle is lun. The human roles and relationships are ren lun. This is the same vocabulary. And so what it does is it produces its own distinctive kind of morality that simply put, no ethical concepts transcend specific types of human relations. So I did the, and so the doctrine of external relations is each human being has his or her integrity as a human being. You come into relationship, you go out of relationship, but you retain your own integrity. And so you're related externally. Internal relationships is when we say we make friends, it's quite literal. We make each other. And when you lose somebody that is really important, it's surgical. You're losing a piece of yourself when you lose somebody. There's a wonderful passage, like Confucius really introduces the notion of ren as a philosophical term in the Analects. Before the Analects, it appears in the classics, but doesn't have this kind of philosophical specificity. And so his students are always saying, Confucius, what do you mean when you say ren? And so in the Shunzi, a later Confucian text, Confucius gives the students an oral examination. He says to the first student, 自贡, when I say ren, what do I mean? And 自贡 says, 爱人, love other people. Confucius says, good answer. He asks student number 2, 自路, when I say ren, what do I mean? 自路 says, 使人爱己, cause other people to love themselves, generate self-worth, self-understanding, self-respect. And Confucius says, oh, this is very good. Then he says to his favorite student, Yan Hui, what do I mean when I say ren? Yan Hui says, 自爱, love yourself. Confucius says, brilliant, graduate school, that loving yourself is not to love yourself exclusive of your relationship, but to love yourself in your relationships. To love yourself in your relationships. Relationally constituted human beings. And so we don't have so much time, but I want to make sure we have lots of time for discussion. I use the 2 terms for this idea of achieving personal identity. One of them is the roles that we have, the li, the roles we have in family and community. And the second one is cognate with li, is the term ti, which is body. That the body is fundamental to the achievement of personal identity. And so the basic argument is that autonomy is a fiction. There's nothing and no one who does anything by themselves. Association is simply a fact. Everything, I breathe because I've got the air. I see because I've got the sun. I walk because I've got the ground. Everything I do is transactional. The Book of Changes, the I Ching, the term I is, I don't have a blackboard, but is 赐予, the 赐. What it means is to gift, to transact with other people. So when we ask, what is the Book of Changes talking about? It's talking about the human being transacting with the world in which we live. How can we optimize the opportunity of a human being by getting the most out of the relationship between the human being and the natural, the cultural, the social worlds in which we live? This is what the text is all about. And so Whitehead talks about this fallacy of simple location. The fallacy of simple location is if we want to understand Gallia, what we do is we isolate her and we take her apart. And the idea, if we think of Plato, of Socrates, know thyself. Know thyself is analytical. The Phaedo, that you get to the soul, you recollect, you find who you really are. But Whitehead says no. He said if we want to understand Gallia, we have to know her narrative. Where does she come? Who are her family? Who are her teachers? Where has she come from? And where is she going? And so the fundamental question in the Confucian tradition is not what is Gallia, but whence is Gallia and whither is Galia. That 我知道, to know is to know the road, is to know the narrative, is to know the story, the personal story. And so if you allow that, if you give me that association as a fact, then the roles that we live are simply stipulated associations, a different kind of associations. Association is kind of a neutral word, but as soon as one association is teacher and student, are you a good teacher? Another association is a husband and a wife. Are you a good husband? Another association is a friend and a friend. Are you a good friend? As soon as we stipulate these associations as specific roles that we live, they become normative. And they become guidelines. Because he is my brother is a powerful moral argument. It's a powerful moral argument. That roles give us, if I say be just to Imbo, then you say, well, that's very abstract. Older brother Imbo, that's very concrete. And then you know what to do. That these roles and relationships that constitute us as persons are our guideline for ethical conduct. In fact, if we speak Chinese instead of having to introduce the word role, 儒学, 伦理学, 伦 is that idea of roles. So if we just say Confucian ethics as opposed to Confucian role ethics, we're saying Confucian role ethics. This is the way the tradition understands its own concept of the moral life. And so to sort of summarize this idea, we are relationally constitutive, gerundive persons. We're human becomings. We become who we are. Being human is not something that you are, it's something that you do. Number two, we achieve personal identity through our roles and through our embodiment. In the Chinese tradition, if we look at the classical texts, the term body is sometimes written with a skeleton, with bones, with the guzapang, which means that because we're embodied, we project, we organize the world in a certain way, we theorize the world, we square the circle, we use our intellect to understand. But sometimes it's written with the shenzapang, with the shenfen de shen, the lived body, a Merleau-Ponty kind of an idea. So because we are alive, then we experience the world. We're lived bodies. We experience the world existentially in a certain way. But sometimes it's written with the rodzapang. Ro is the carnal body. And so Richard Schusterman, his work on the soma aesthetic. Because I have a body, I can educate the body to enjoy life. I can develop an eye to look at art and see the world in a way that is different. I can develop an ear and listen to beautiful music. I can develop a palate and eat wonderful food. That the body is an opportunity for us to aestheticize the human experience. And so the body and our roles and relationships are fundamental to developing our personal identities. Moral imagination as the ground of becoming moral, and a kind of atheistic, family-centered religiousness. This is a tradition. Marcel Grenet, the best sinology of French sinologist, 20th century, says quite simply, Confucian wisdom, Chinese wisdom has no need for the idea of God. And so what does God mean? God in philosophy is logic. God in ethics would be irrecusable moral principles. God in politics would be the final constitution that defines the way in which human beings ought to govern themselves. And so this is not part of the Chinese tradition, this idea of an absolute. But when Chinese go home at New Year's, and And if the term religion is in fact religare, is in fact binding tightly, one way of binding tightly is for me to bind tightly with my God. Truth and beauty and goodness resides there. Another way of binding tightly is going home, to my old home, eating the food, being in the place where my ancestors come from, renewing my relationship with my family members and my neighbors and so the Chu-yi, Chu-ar, Chu-san, day number 1, 2, 3. In China, 2 weeks. The cities empty out. Everybody goes back home and renews themselves for another year through binding tightly with the relationships that are most integral to their identity as persons. So what we need is if we look in the Oxford English Dictionary, it'll define religion beginning with the concept of God. And so when missionaries go to China, they try to find that idea within the Chinese world. If we look at Baidu, the Chinese dictionary, it also starts with this concept of God. But again, what it is this idea of overriding the Chinese tradition with Western theory is not simply a problem of Western scholars, that Chinese themselves, that Western modernity was imported wholesale into East Asia in the last part of the 19th century. The educational apparatus of the West was appropriated wholesale, and the vocabulary of modernity was translated into these languages. And so if you speak modern Chinese, in many ways you're speaking a Western lung, a Western conceptual structure, through a vernacular Chinese, Japanese, Korean language. And so if we look at Chinese literature, we look at Western literature, the interpretation of the tradition is resonant. Now, of course, this way of thinking is not peculiarly Chinese. We don't want to exoticize the Chinese tradition. We can take Mead. The self cannot arise in experience except as there are others there. The child experiences sounds before it has experienced its own body. There's nothing in the child that arises as his own experience and then is referred to the outside things. Only a superficial philosophy demands the old view that we start with ourselves. There is no self before there is a world, and no world before the self. The process of formation of the self is social. So this idea of irreducibly social is not something that simply belongs to a Chinese tradition. Dewey says similar kinds of things. William James, the rejection of substance. The low thermometer today, for instance, is supposed to come from something called the climate. Climate is really only the name for a certain group of days, but it is treated as if it lay behind the day. And in general, we place the name as if it were a being behind the facts it is the name of. But the phenomenal properties of things do not inhere in anything. They adhere or cohere rather with each other. And the notion of a substance inaccessible to us, which we think accounts for such cohesion by supporting it, as cement might support pieces of a mosaic, must be abandoned. The fact of the bare cohesion itself is all the notion of the substance signifies. Behind that fact is nothing. So the argument is that a person is a habitude. A person is a range of roles and relationships in the world without having to posit some kind of essential identity. So this notion, the Buddhist notion of no self, is developed within the Chinese tradition. While at the same time we look back at the Confucian and the Taoist traditions as being something different. But in fact, the ontology, the idea of the human being as an event, the ontology is the same. This passage is the holography, William James. In the pulse of inner life, immediately present now in each of us is a little past, a little future, a little awareness of our own body, of each other's persons. Of these sublimities we are trying to talk about, of the Earth's geography and the direction of history, of truth and error, of good and bad, and of who knows how much more. Feeling, however dimly and subconsciously, all these things, your pulse of inner life is continuous with them, belongs to them, and they to it. The real units of our immediately felt life are unlike the units that intellectualist logic holds to and makes its calculations with. They are not separate from their own others, and you have to take them at widely separated dates to find any two of them that seem unblent. My present field of consciousness is a center surrounded by a fringe that shades insensibly into a subconscious more. Which part of it properly is in my consciousness, which out? If I name what is out, it already has come in. The center works in one way while the margins work in another, and presently overpower the center and are central themselves. What we conceptually identify ourselves with and say we are thinking of at any time is the center, but our full self is the whole field, with all of those indefinitely radiating subconscious possibilities of increase. And so it's not exotic, it's not different. But these pragmatists, the Dewey, the James, these are so radical within their own tradition that it's a century later before we begin to really understand what these pragmatists are trying to say. I won't read more, do we? And so the contrast is between human beings. The first question in the first Aristotelian text, the categories, is what is a man? Aristotle wants to give a full predication. He wants to give a full description of something, and so he takes his example to be the man in the marketplace. And so the first ontological question is, what is a man? And then the questions that follow from it are the attributes: where, when, state of mind, what is he doing, and so on. All of these questions then are in the man. So what can be said of the man, what is in the man? You have ontological questions. But in the, is there a viable alternative to individualism? This notion of human becomings. In what way does a person become consummately human? This then is the perennial Confucian question asked explicitly in all of the 4 books. And the answer from the time of Confucius was a moral, aesthetic, and ultimately religious one. One becomes human by cultivating those thick intrinsic relations that constitute one's initial conditions and that locate the trajectory of one's life force within family, community, and cosmos. Cultivate your person is the signature exhortation of the Confucian canons. That by cultivating ourselves, we produce meaning in the world. I'm going to stop here because I'm a philosopher. I can talk until dark. We could go on here, but what I want to do is I want to have a chance to have a conversation. So let's stop here and see what people have to say.
Questions, comments? I will start.
Okay.
Okay. Jumping. Okay. No, go on. Go ahead.
No, I just want to ask one question is, what kind of role the concept of entails the Chuan, adjusting yourself, play in your role ethics in government?
The
Chuan, it means that you all sometimes to adjust yourself. Okay,
Oh, I see. Chuan, yeah.
The argument between mentals
Yeah,
and Chuan,
yeah,
about your sister-in-law is strong.
Sure. No, absolutely. Like when you live roles and relationships are going to be conflicted. They're going to be, you're going to have to adjust. And so the term Chuan is to calibrate. How do you calibrate your relationships so that you live your relationships in the most efficient way? And so this is really an important question because the central idea, like this is a tradition without the kind of teleology that you find with a tradition that begins with a concept of God. You don't have a beginning and then some kind of projected end. So the kind of linear historiographies that we have within Abrahamic tradition, within a scientific tradition, within a Hegelian or a Marxist kind of tradition, you don't have this idea, this strong teleology. And so then what does the work of teleology is the notion of he, the notion of harmony. But it's not simply harmony in the sense of attunement, that the idea that family is fundamental is a strategy. That the way that we get the most out of people is by making a family, religious orders. You know, make people have family relationships, mother superior and brothers and father, and all of this kind of language is used, because when it comes to family, that's where you pull the stops out. If my family needs me, it doesn't matter, you know, what I'm doing, where I am, if they need my money, if they need my time, if they need my kidney. Probably now I'm getting kind of old, so you probably don't want the kidney, but whatever they want, I have to respond. So the idea of using family as the governing metaphor is a way of getting the most out of your ingredients. Think of a Chinese menu. You go to a Chinese restaurant, page after page after page of stuff, finite number of ingredients, combining them in different ways, different colors, different smells, different kinds of relationships, trying to produce the maximum variations. And then you always eat family style, so you get a group of friends, and then you take the most expensive element, meat, you put a little bit of meat, and a lot, then you eat it with rice or noodles or bing. I mean, what you're trying to do in the kitchen is the same as what you're trying to do in the family, and that is to optimize what you can get out of your ingredients. And so he is not simply harmony, it's an optimizing harmony. It's trying to get the most out of your relationships. So the notion of xiao, of family reverence, is fundamental. It's the moral imperative. How do we get the most out of our relationships? Thank you, Zhang Ping.
I have two questions.
Okay, here and then here.
One is if you can give us some of a contemporary context for the things for Confucian role ethics. Okay, it's nice that we are doing it inside the academy, and it's something that we are living. And now lately I'm struggling with the question how to take Confucianism and put it into practice in Israeli, for example, like an educational project.
Right.
It could be any other framework.
Right.
So this is the first question. The second about the shin, the heart mind. We spoke about human relatedness and relations. And this morning we heard Zahavi, he's talking about knowledge, phenomenology, and consciousness, and he spoke about individualism. And when you challenged him, he said, I cannot imagine a kind of social phenomenology, like or a social consciousness. And if we speak of heart mind, I'm thinking about my own shin, right? And if here we are Dadia together, do we have a different or more a group heart mind?
Good.
Think about something.
Yeah, very helpful questions. First one is 知行合一, is the inseparability of knowing and practice, authentication in practice. And so the idea of role ethics, the dedication of this book is, I was telling Zhang Ping about it at lunchtime. My old teacher, my doctoral supervisor was a D.C. Lau. And in his time, he was the most famous translator of Chinese classics. His Tao Te Ching has sold 3 or 4 million copies. My Tao Te Ching has sold 30, 40,000 copies, 3 million copies. I mean, and so, but D.C. Lau was somebody who never got married, and none of his siblings got married. And so he was this single person. But at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, one of my PhD students actually became his granddaughter, would have lunch with him almost every day. The Chinese department, when he got really old, would send students to his residence to pretend that they were reading these difficult Chinese texts together. And it goes on like that. Like finally, when he passed away, his plaque is in a temple in Hong Kong. And twice a year, not once a year, but twice a year, this group of about 20 people A message goes out on the email, who's going to be around, and we're going to, maybe half of them at any one time will find their way there. I just, in the middle of December, I was there. Away I go to his plaque, and you burn incense, and you remember this man where if there wasn't DC Lao, there wouldn't be me. That's the feeling. Okay, so it's real. Like that, in the dedication, I said, if you really want to understand role ethics, don't read this book. Go see these people in Hong Kong. You know, they'll teach you more about role ethics than I can say in this book. So that's the first question. Then the second one is about Xin. Oh, about phenomenology. Yeah, one of the, like for me, individualism is a fiction. In its own time, it was a liberating fiction. You know, you have aristocrats and serfs. You know, you have minorities. You have gender. And so the assertion of the individual worth of each person. But the fact of the matter is that it's now become a pernicious fiction. 8 people in the world own half of the world's wealth. You know, this idea of autonomy and freedom and you know, rationality as being the fundamental definition of the human being, without, I mean, an ideology, because we don't have an alternative, that it becomes a default position, and so then you have that kind of starting point where everything is in fragments, you know, that experiences are individual, you know, having the same experience in a different way. The language of it, for me, is, in the Confucian tradition, there's a simple idea that Tang Juni, you know, the great 20th century, he says, "Yi duo bu feng guan." "Yi duo bu feng guan." "Yi" is one, "duo" is many, "bu fen" is inseparable. So if we talk about a person, there's only one imbo, but there's a whole bunch of people who come together to constitute this particular person. You talk about Tao in the Chinese tradition, the way of the human being, there's all kinds of different Tao, but Ren Tao, the human way, is the confluence of the different Taos that human beings are living, the different narratives that human beings are living. And so the idea of you know, the point is, if it's not one, then it's two. That's one way of thinking. But the inseparability of one and many is the other way of talking. So subjectivity is certainly there, a profound subjectivity, and there's objectivity, but they're not separate. You can never separate these two things. That subjectivity always has a content. And so the idea of Xin is something that's in the world. Xin is not something inside your head. It's not something inside your body. Xin is participation in the mind of the world.
So we share the same Xin?
It's not, I mean, the term same is this kind of notion of strict identity. We share Xin where it's Yi, it's continuous, but it's duo. It's looked at from many different perspectives. It's participated, it's a discourse. Mind is a continuing discourse. Infants can't remember being children, but as they gradually enter this shared discourse, they achieve an identity.
Feeling that when you spoke about the derivative nature of maybe it's something linked to the very nature of the Chinese language.
Mm.
And because every word gets its function and from its place in the sentence.
Exactly.
And not only that, the Chinese verb doesn't have the limit that we have in different languages. It's like a qualitative verb, so you have to actualize it.
Right, right.
And,
No.
I had a feeling that
Mhm.
it's very... pervasive in the language and the way people think.
Yeah. The language, absolutely, and we can go down that road. Like the language expresses. Chinese language, a term means by what it means by virtue of where it is, just as Galia is Galia by virtue of where she is. If she's in a different place, then she's a different person. You know, she has a different set of roles and relationships. The language reflects that. The term Ming, to be bright, is not agent-centered, it's situation-centered. So brightness is both something that is bright, but it's also the perspicacity to see things in a bright way. The term xin is not simply trust, it's also credibility. And so xin is a trusting situation that has credibility and trust. And so the language, it reflects this way of, this cosmology, this way of thinking about persons, about words, and so on. Absolutely right. Over here and then here. Wu Lao Shi. No, over here. Okay.
I go first.
Okay.
Okay. Actually, in Chinese, we have a traditional phrase. It's called "White House is not house."
Oh yeah.
You know that it's
Yeah.
famous phrase.
Bai
And
Ma
if
Fei Ma.
we talk about if you are an individual,
Mhm.
you are not a human. You are not family.
Right.
And our own everything is prepared for the family. So
Right.
that means there is no individual.
Right.
So, but I don't think it's a good thing for now in China. I don't think it's a good thing for the individual to living in the world.
Well.
If there is no right for the individual.
Right.
So I think how the Confucius philosophy to deal with this situation. When we talk about Confucius philosophy today in China, we talk about more about family, about those xiao, about those things. But we don't talk about the individual. We don't deal with the individual's rights things, and everything will miss in the family. So,
But we have to be really clear on what we're talking about. Like the term individuality and individualism is very different. The term individual has to do with discrete, separate, marbles in a jar, discrete entities. That would be a certain kind, that would be the foundational individualism. But individuality has to do with the uniqueness of the person. And so if you begin from a kind of Platonic model where by virtue of having some self-same identical characteristic, we are all human beings, that's a rather truncated concept of uniqueness. We're essentially the same and incidentally different. And so that's a very kind of shallow notion of individuality. But if I am all of these roles and relationships all the way down, that notion, the Confucian notion of self, of individuality and so on, is a much stronger idea than the assumption that we're all the same in some essential way. So that would be the first point. Second point would be that when we say that we don't have individuals, like a family, the concept of family is that if you are this great musician, ma yo yo, you know, then make the family famous by becoming who you are. If you're this incredible businessman, then we should all be driving Beamers, you know. That if you are the scholar, you know, then bring reputation to the scholar. And so the idea of intergenerational transmission is the idea that the ancestors live on in the present generation. That you have the surname Wu, and so then you have a given name. And so what are you going to do for the so the notion of bian tong, the I Ching, you know, the idea of persistence and change. And so the name Wu is persistent, but it changes over time by virtue of the contribution that particular Wu make to the tradition. Now, when we take something like human rights, you look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, first 20 articles are all about entitlements. I am this individual person, these are all, I'm owed this kind of stuff, you can't take, you know, these are my rights. But if you look at the last 7 articles, They're all about having food on the table, having a roof over your head, having a job, having a school to send your kids to, having a hospital to go to when you're ill, having security in the community, and so on. That those kinds of social rights, and the first 20 are incoherent. That I can't have all of the stuff that belongs to me if in some degree I'm responsible for the education of other people's children and a hospital that will take care of old people and so on. I have to give too. And so that second generation concept of rights in China is really flourishing. I mean, China is a very, the economy is booming, people are happy, they've got jobs, they've got schools, they've got hospitals. 50 million Americans don't have health care. Richest country in the world. What about China? If you get sick, you got a place to go. So when it comes to human rights, if you begin from the individual, China is a great failure when it comes to individual human rights. But if you were to invoke those human rights, that this is my hutong, this is my old-style Chinese building, and so nobody can take it away, then you can't build the condominium that will house 100 families instead of 2 families, you know. And so there's I'm not an apologist for the Chinese government, but I am somebody who lives in China and who appreciates the progress China has made in one generation. I mean, it's really quite phenomenal. I go to China in 1985. How long ago is 1985? I go in through Shanghai. The tallest building is Heping Dafandian, you know, the Peace Hotel, 22 stories. Now Shanghai has more skyscrapers than New York City. Is it beautiful? I don't think so. You know, it's a phenomenon. That's China. Like in one generation, it's gone from people not having food to this kind of flourishing. It's really quite phenomenal. Yeah. And it's coming, you know. As America withdraws from international relations, as a beleaguered Europe is reinforcing boundaries, the Chinese notion of Yi-Dai-Lu, Chang'e, you know, the one belt, one road, the new Silk Road, China's really serious about this. And so we better understand what's going on there. And we better find a way to hold China true to its rhetoric. You know, it talks about Gongying, it talks about Gongtongti, you know, it talks about equity, it talks about shared diversity. But we really have to make sure that we understand how that is expressed in the canons of the tradition, and both externally and internally hold China to account for it.
That's a question from the West.
Yes.
Just to continue what my
sure.
previous question was, but I find that you portray the family, family values, etc., family metaphor as a liberating force in a sense. Whereas I think it's quite common to say, not only is it not a liberating force, but family is probably one of the most oppressive establishments in world history. So family is not simply a way to define relationships.
Right.
Indeed, and reciprocity. Indeed, family is something much more than that. There were certain things that you assumed implicitly,
Sure.
self-evident.
Right.
Namely, if my brother needs something, then obviously I have to give him everything. Whereas, you know, the first question a Western philosopher would say, is your brother worthy of it? Are you sure that your brother is more important than other people? Is it simply the fact that he is blood related to you? And if you want to look at, you know, the Western tradition, I think it's somewhere, it doesn't begin there. But think of Jesus saying, he who does not deny his mother and father is not worthy of me. I mean, it's not, there is something that is above family. So I think perhaps you could elaborate a little on those oppressive elements in family. And I think to some extent this was suggested by Mike.
But this is very good. One thing we have to do is we really have to be critical. And that is that you can say that family, let's all have a big hug. You know, that family sounds liberating.
That's not my family.
But family is also the source of corruption. Like in China today, you have endemic corruption. You have so much corruption that the people who are reigning in corruption are corrupt. You know, so the corruption is probably the greatest obstacle to the sort of a shared productive future if this present generation doesn't get past the past generation, the last generation, and do something about the corruption, then China's future is not viable. That corruption has to be reined in, and that's what they're doing right now. That's what they're trying to do. So, absolute intimate relationships misused are the source of corruption.
But the challenge by the Chinese thinkers themselves is the family simply sacred? Is it never challenged? Does nobody say to himself, well, yes,
Oh, sure.
nepotism is bad.
No,
your father is not necessarily the best person in the world.
Of course, like the notion of xiao, it comes together with the notion of jian. That xiao, you're a West, you are really a Westerner. Believe me. I mean, here's the starting point, and that is that family is not used as it's not appealed to as a model of order, of social order within the Western philosophical tradition broadly. Plato says get rid of family, just like Jesus is saying get rid of family, because it's not objective. So objectivity.
It's conservative.
It's well, I mean, it might be oppressive, but it's the most important social institution for most people. So the idea that human relationships are misused is what Confucianism is all about. You can't get away from the fact of relationships. The relationships is the nature of the human experience. And so then the question is, how do you make the most of it? That's what Confucianism is all about. And for Confucianism, unlike some Western people, the idea of family is oppressive and can be oppressive. I mean, Susan Moeller-Oken, you know, justice and family within the Western tradition. If the family life is saturated with gender oppression, then how can you construct a just society out of it? Very, very, very good. A very important question. But the answer to that question is not to get rid of gender. The answer to that question is to do the gender relationship in a much better way than we've done it, you know. That's the point, that we have to rethink. Family is an open-ended concept in our own time. The idea of same-sex families, a Confucianism that can't respond to the challenges of our contemporary period is a Confucianism that's going to be left behind, you know. So your point is well taken, and that is that family is not that we have to be critical, but at the end of the day, I think most people would say that family is a very important social institution. Over here, and then here, and then here. Oh, yeah. Actually, he is first. But we got distracted.
First of all, thank you very much. My question is also about the family. I wondered, can family be anything other than humans? I mean, for example, natural environment or animals. And my second question, which is basically the same, do people perceive environment, the non-human environment, in language of family?
Yeah. Well, I think that's the idea of what we call what is the new term for it? Anthropocene. You know, the idea of the sociality of the environment. That what you have in the Confucian tradition it's very interesting. Like you have the Analects of Confucius is very much focused on human relationships. That we can become consummate as human beings by living our human relationships properly. The Taoists come along and they say to the Confucians, you've got it half right, that relationships are really important, but relationships go way beyond simply human beings. That there are, you know, kiss a dog, hug a tree. You know, that there are elements in our environment that are really important for the well-being of the human being. And so then the Confucian tradition turns in that direction. The Zhongyong is what is considered to be, by some philosophers, the highest statement of the Confucian project. And it's all about the cosmic nature of the human experience and how, if the human being can live properly and be respectful of the cosmos as we inherit it, as we participate in it, then we can live the most flourishing kind of life. And so it's an inclusive way of thinking about the human experience, not an exclusive one. Not human exceptionalism, not speciesism, but the idea that we have to pay attention to all of the elements that constitute the human experience and try to get the most out of them. What we're doing right now is we're favoring the human being at the expense of the rest of the planet. And if you keep on going in that direction, we won't continue.
We won't get.
Yeah, we'll be gone, and something else. The cockroaches will be in charge. So, then.
What about the individual and the nation?
Individual and
The nation,
the nation.
yes.
Yeah, well, that's the point. That if we think of sovereign states as individuals, then we have a model of winners and losers. But the kind of problems that the human being faces today, global warming, pandemic, food water shortage, nuclear proliferation, environmental degradation, massive species extinction, all of these problems can't be solved by America, can't be solved by Israel, can't be solved by China, but together we have the cultural resources where we can make a go of it. And so we have to move from a winner and loser individual model to winners and winners. Either we win together or we lose together. It's that simple. So, but over here I had, where are the questions? Yeah, over here. This lady first.
Okay, so you spoke about the relation between, or the interaction, the communication between two worlds of thought, right? Say the Western tradition
Right,
and
right.
the Chinese tradition. I want to ask you about a different pair of worlds within the world of sinology.
Okay.
So about, say, two camps within in terms of the approach.
Sure.
The study of Chinese thought that, some term the constructivist and the perhaps reconstructivist.
Sure.
Right, so in general, if we fancy ourselves reconstructivists, we pay close attention, and I apologize in advance for the crude generalizations. We pay close attention to, the political and historical context and the multiplicity of traditions,
Sure.
and hermeneutical traditions,
Sure.
et cetera, the limits of etymological explanations, et cetera,
Sure.
et cetera. Perhaps like archaeologists, right? If we have fragments, then that's what we have.
Right, we have fragments.
And if we're on the constructivist camp, what we want perhaps is to direct the spotlight to a particular corner and use it as a foundation on which to build, right? Something that would contribute to humanity, something more than fragments, right? Say maybe perhaps in this case, architecture would be the appropriate metaphor. And so again, that's a very crude dichotomy,
Sure.
which not necessarily is tenable when we look at particular cases, but since I think there is this tension within the sinological world, and I'm not sure that they shouldn't be camps, but these two worlds are not necessarily communicating fruitfully at this point. And so my question to you is, well, I'm not sure if you would be willing to position yourself
In one of those.
regard, but the more important question is how you envision the future communication
Right.
between these two.
Well, I would say that the first camp is absolutely essential for the second camp to do its work. That the idea what we need is good scholarship. We need to appreciate the differences. When you come out, like for me, the I Ching is really fundamental to understanding the vocabulary that we need to establish an interpretive context, to stop reading China through a Western lens, but to really allow it to speak for itself. And so that tradition is really important, but that tradition is all about bientong. It's all about persistence, but change over time. Like what we know is that China is a narrative. And when we think of all of the influence, how China has transformed across the century, I mean, it's really quite extraordinary. And so it's a very complex situation that we have to look at from many different perspectives. At the same time, as a philosopher of culture, I really want to say we really have to pay attention to Tong as well. Tong is the persistent identity, that Chineseness is alive and well. When we think, I was just thinking the other day, when you think of the Romans and contemporary Italy, when you think of the Greeks and contemporary Greece, that there seems to be a disjunction in there that isn't the same as China, that there seems to be a persistence within the Chinese cultural tradition that maybe has to do with the canons of the tradition, that, so, like, we of course we need to talk more about how you see these two camps, but as somebody who is philosophically committed, my commitment to philosophy is not technical philosophy. It's how can we produce the social intelligence necessary to address the pressing issues of our time. And my argument is that we need all of human culture in order to do that this antique tradition called China that is constantly being bashed, like the Western media can say nothing good about China. There's lots to criticize China for, but being entirely critical is not critical. Being entirely critical is fake news. It's a failure on the part of the people reporting on China in that way to do the work that is necessary to understand both the failings and the achievements of China. Both of these things together. And so if that's what you mean by the second group, somebody who's focused on trying to use culture to address the pressing issues of the time, then that's who I would identify with, but I would be very grateful for all of the different voices and the criticisms that come out of those voices towards somebody who tries to do what I do.
One last question, please.
Who was the next?
Perhaps Professor Ariel?
Oh, my old friend.
How would you, well, I have a question about the analects. And I would like to express it in two different ways.
Oh.
Okay, first, how would you incorporate your view of Confucianism as a whole with analects, book 4, analect 8, you hear about Tao in the morning, etc.
Oh.
And how would you explain your notion of the concept of Tao into this analect as well?
Sure.
And now the alternative way of expressing this question. Can you think about a person who lives alone on a deserted island, and we finally find him? His name is Mongze or Wang Yangming.
Oh, yeah.
That is a Confucian.
Right.
Well, obviously, if the answer is yes, we can find such a man, then your theory of role ethics and Confucianism bumps into a great deal of trouble, right?
Okay.
So this is it.
Those are the questions. Okay. I think they're both the same kind of question. Yeah. And the first one, what I would say is, when you hear the analects are not expository. The analects are not, like Aristotle says, sit down, pick up your pencil, I'm going to tell you the way the world is. It's expository. It's giving you what you need in order to understand the world. The Chinese texts are making a point. A watch pot never boils. Watch pots always boil. I know it as an empirical fact. I've watched them. I've done it. They boil. there's a point being made. And so I think the point that is being made that when I understand Tao in the morning, I can die in the evening without regret. You know, that kind of an idea. It's not that Tao is the truth. It's when I understand the context in which I live, when I fully appreciate the narrative of which I am a part, well, then I have everything. I don't need more than that. Okay, but the second point, the idea of Robinson Crusoe, that when you have somebody who is put onto a desert island, that person doesn't leave their sociality behind. Their sociality comes with them. I'm sure that Robinson Crusoe, without his pants on, would feel very much ashamed, you know? That the feelings that we have are a function of the world, of the narratives that we have lived. And so role ethics don't go away simply because we're isolated as human beings. In fact, in many ways, they are accentuated by that fact. I'm sure that Robinson Crusoe was thinking about his roles and relationships every moment of his life and trying to get back to those roles and relationships. Are you keen?
Just some concluding words because we have to leave in 2 minutes.
Okay, then I won't give my little story, but there is a.
Oh, give us a little story, please.
Okay. There's a story called Kisugatami in the Buddhist canons. And Kisugatami, the story is very simple. The story is that Kisugatami is this woman who is so happy. She has her aged parents live with her. She has this husband who's tall and strong and handsome and loves his family. She has a son that's growing up to be like the father, and they've recently given birth to a young daughter. And so her life is magnificent. And then one day, the floods come. And the aged parents can't save themselves, they drown. But when the floods come, the bandits come to take advantage of chaos. And so the bandits come into the town, her husband stands up to defend his family, and they strike him dead. And so this woman, Kisugatami, says to her son, take care of your sister. I have to go down to the river to send your grandparents, your father, on their way. So she goes down to the river. But another thing that happens when the floods come is the animals come out of the jungle. And so she comes home to find a tiger gnawing on the lifeless body of her son. She loses it. She's gone. And so she wanders with this daughter who dies because she's not paying attention to it. She wanders through the village, through the villages with this corpse attached to her body. And everybody stays away from this crazy lady. She's filthy, she's incontinent, she's out of here. And so one compassionate young woman comes to Kisugatami and says, I think there's somebody who can help you. And so this young woman takes Kisugatami to the river, and there the Buddha is speaking. And he says to her, what I need you to do is I need you to go into the village and find me a mustard seed from the house that has not suffered death. I can help you. Find me that mustard seed. And so that's the story. That's the story. But the way of interpreting that in the Western commentaries, the Indo-European commentaries, is that what she does is she goes into the village and she discovers that death is a function of where you have life, you have death. She has learned an eternal truth. Know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Right. But in the Chinese canons, the way that this is interpreted is that she goes to the first house. And this is cousin Bob. And so what she does is she says to Bob, this is my life, all of this misfortune. And so he says, don't you remember last year when typhoid came and I lost my... And so they hug each other and they cry. And then she goes to the next house. Like this isn't Los Angeles, this is a village. And she goes to the next house, and we went to school together, and she says to her classmate, you know, this is what, and the wisdom in the Chinese tradition is that an isolated human being without roles, a human being that has had her most important roles severed, cannot function. And so what the Buddha is saying to her is begin again, rekindle your roles. That doesn't mean you forget your husband and your parents and your children, but in order to grieve properly, you have to reconstitute yourself as a relationally constituted human being. And so there's a contrast between an individual who learns the truth and the truth is liberating, and an individual who has to rekindle relationships in order to be competent as a human being. That's my story. Well, my pleasure. My pleasure.
Okay. The emotions workshop is going on in this room